Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I wanted to start off today's stream talking about this meeting. This meeting was something else. Okay, so basically, Blinken, Blinken and others met with Chinese diplomats, Anthony Blinken specifically, and they met to kind of do a kickoff of American-Chinese relations going into this Biden presidency. And to say the least, it had some rough sailing right off the bat. And hours before the meeting, actually, we placed sanctions on Hong Kong officials, individual sanctions on individual officials. It wasn't like fuel sanctions or something like that. It was much like Magnitsky sanctions that I talk about a lot. It was specifically directed on certain Chinese officials involved in activities in Hong Kong. And that, of course, angered the Chinese diplomats. And then we brought up what angered us when it came up to Xinjiang, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, copyright infringement, a lot of things. And then they responded, bringing up, they responded by talking about American human rights abuses when it comes particularly to black people. They actually said that we slaughter black people, which that's extremely strong language, not entirely inaccurate, but extremely strong language. But the word slaughter, when the translator was there trying to translate what was happening, wasn't translated. So the Chinese diplomat said that we slaughter black people, and then the diplomat said something along the lines of, "You're not very nice to black people." Anyway, we're gonna watch some of this meeting take place because it's extremely interesting to watch from the outside. Also, at the end of the meeting, the Chinese diplomats tried to make the media and press leave, and we called them back because we wanted to say one last thing on camera. It was fireworks.
This is a meeting that will shape future relations between the world's two biggest powers, relations that are currently at a low point.
Good afternoon, and welcome.
Normally, opening remarks at events like these are brief and polite, but the US side went on to list their specific concerns.
In Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies.
Okay, so considering how we opened off right off the bat, how we opened up here, I want to say a few things. It has been said multiple times that Biden is doing a shift to Asia, and we're going to talk about statements by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, later, referring to North Korea, showing further that we are doing a pivot to Asia. We're going to be investing a lot of diplomatic capital in Asia, and this is just further example of that right off the bat when it comes to American-Chinese relations. We hit the ground running, trying to address the issues that concern American interests, human rights abuses, etc. I'm going to say that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is, again, this is further proof that any idea that, like, the Biden administration is full of the Chi-Com opposition, is going to be soft on China, that Biden is owned by China, that he's the big guy, and all these conspiracy theorist ideas is complete nonsense. Biden was part of the administration that started freedom of navigation operations, which was the most successful counterance to Chinese military power in the South China Sea, to help uphold the fact that they are international waters and it is not their territory, as they claim 80% of the South China Sea. The Biden administration invited what is essentially a Taiwanese ambassador to his inauguration. He has rejected and condemned the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, aircrafts going into Taiwanese airspace and using it to try to test its defenses. They've condemned that and rejected that right off the bat. I have seen no reversals of any weapons deals or trade deals when it comes to Taiwan. In fact, it seems that the Biden administration is going to be extremely supportive of Taiwan, and it seems that this first big meeting of the powers between America and China, he kicks it off by just going straight into it. And that's right after we placed a bunch of sanctions on officials involved in abuses in Hong Kong and other areas. Direct sanctions on officials, not general sanctions of the economy. So this idea, and I'm not even arguing for or against these policies, I'm talking about, in this instance, I'm just saying this idea that Biden is going to be soft on China, or that his administration is going to be soft on China, is a fairy tale. This conspiracy theory of him being owned by some mythical Chi-Com opposition is a fairy tale. Just wanted to make that super clear.
The Chinese response was long and just as frank. The Foreign Minister Wang Yi said you don't welcome guests with sanctions, a reference to the blacklisting of 24 Chinese and Hong Kong officials in the hours before the meeting. His senior colleague, Politburo member Yang.
That's an interesting. That's actually really interesting. I wonder why, because there's no. Did they say it was hours beforehand? Because I think it's hours as well. That's what I remember reading.
Sanctions, a reference to the blacklisting of 24 Chinese and Hong Kong officials in the hours before the meeting.
In the hours, okay. So it's an interesting move for them to do it right then, because they could have chosen after this meeting, or maybe they wanted to get it out of the way. But this probably was some type of signal that we are going to be extremely strong. We're going to have a tough stance. That's probably the signal the Biden administration was trying to send right off the bat, that it was showing right off the bat that, hey, these are our priorities. We are going to back our priorities with fiscal power, with our not allowing them to use our economic infrastructure, and just straight off the bat, bam, this is our policies. This is our position, and we're going to show it through these direct sanctions on these Chinese and Hong Kong officials who we think are not acting in the way in compliance with deals that we've made, or in compliance with international law, human rights, or our interests. So it's a strong statement, and it's followed up with another strong statement with, right when the meeting gets off the back, in front of the cameras, delivering all these strong language. And then once the Chinese diplomats respond with their own list of concerns and saying that this is not how nations behave, and then they ask for the media to leave, Blinken calls for the media to stay and to record what he's about to say about Japan and Korea. So, again, I just want to point out that anyone who thinks that Biden is going to have an extremely tough, soft China policy is delusional. Is he going to have open diplomatic channels with China? Is he not going to decouple? Of course, but that's reasonable strategy. We don't want a world war. I just want to again make that point very, very clear, and I want to say thank you, nothing, for the tier 1. I appreciate that.
Meeting. His senior colleague, Politburo member Yang Jiechu, was clearly unhappy.
Well, I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought the US side would follow the necessary diplomatic protocols.
I do want to also say that this idea that we were going to have a diplomatic reset, as in we were going to try to reset relations, go back to where it was before, that seems to be dead. I don't see any chance of that happening. I do think that Biden will be able to approach these people more reasonably, more rationally, and actually understand the situations that we're facing. Example, Trump, for example, when he was first told about what's going on in Xinjiang, he actually approved of it in closed-door meetings with Chinese officials to Xi. This is actually written about in John Bolton's book. I think it was My Days in the White House or something. It was in that book. And of course, he was Trump's national security advisor. So this isn't just some anonymous source. This is a person raising his hand, directly telling who said the story here. So there's not going to be a diplomatic reset. That is a fantasy, almost as much of a fantasy as the Chi-Com opposition. It seems that we're going to still have an extremely tense situation. It doesn't seem we're going to have a cooling period, even though if we have someone who acts more like an adult at the helm. We're not going to have that diplomatic reset. It's not going to happen.
He went on to complain about regime change in the Middle East and the US's own human rights record.
The challenges facing the US in human rights are deep-seated. They did not emerge over the past 4 years. The slaughter of black people, the problem existed for a long time.
The word slaughter was not translated into English for those in the room by the Chinese delegation's interpreter.
Hold on 1 second, please.
I just want to say, the thing is, and this has been something I've talked about on multiple occasions, when you go to the international stage to talk about human rights abuses, it makes it a lot easier if they can't just say, well, aren't you a hypocrite, and then point to your own human rights abuses. This is one of multiple reasons that we should address our own human rights abuses. We need to address the conditions of black people in the United States. We need to address police brutality. We need to address the impact of generational wealth. We need to address the structural inequality. These are things we need to address. And there's also the fact that if you look at what we did in Afghanistan, even if you want to talk about the justifications of the war, we have managed the war extremely poorly. The amount of money we've spent is ridiculous. The amount of time it's taken for us to try to have a successful operation is ridiculous. The Taliban still control or contest about half of the country. I think they control about 13%, but contest about another 33%, getting close to about one half of the country. Not going to happen. I mean, we hope that after a peace deal is made, then we can finally have that withdrawal. But with all these diplomatic and political issues, it's very difficult for us to avoid criticism on the international stage if we messed up that much. You could look at depacification in Iraq as another failure. You can look at the lack of the resurgence of ISIS, even though we were the one who was supposed to help retrain and rebuild the Iraqi military, as another failure. The fact that ISIS was even able to find a foothold in Afghanistan at all could be considered a fail. There's a lot of failures we could point to. So them being able to point to that, it's obvious. It's easy for them to just point in that direction, say, look, failure. That's one thing. And of course, the long history of mistreatment of black people in this country is no secret to anyone in the international community, and is another soft spot for us, definitely, if we're trying to talk about the rights of minorities like Uyghur Muslims in China.
Journalists were about to be ushered out when the Secretary of State made it clear his delegation wanted to speak again.
I just made my first trip, as I noted, to Japan and South Korea. I have to tell you, what I'm hearing...
Japan and South Korea both also have disputes with China in multiple areas. One example would be Japan and the Senkaku Islands, which is a disputed piece of territory between Japan and China. But Japan, as of right now, has basically de facto control of the Senkaku Islands.
...is very different from what you described. I'm hearing deep satisfaction that the United States is back, that we're re-engaged with our allies and partners. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
A confident country is able to look hard at its own shortcomings and constantly seek to improve. And that is the secret sauce of America.
Alaska is a midway point, just over 6,000 kilometers to Beijing, just under 6,000 kilometers to Washington, D.C. This was a meeting that was supposed to build bridges. What we've seen here could be a welcome clearing of the air, or perhaps the beginning of a deepening of the division. It all depends on the crucial talks which now continue behind closed doors. James Bayes, Al Jazeera.
The thing about black people is literally ancient Soviet whataboutism, but I know that. Look, yeah, this was something that was brought up by the Soviets a lot, and you know what? When the Soviets said it, they were right about that too. The thing is, if we stand up and we criticize China's human rights abuses, and they can easily just turn around and said, what about that? And they just point to the condition of black people in this country. I mean, it's a good whataboutism, isn't it? Because you want to know what? They're right. They're right that we've been mistreating black people terribly in this country. So you want to know what my solution is? My international diplomatic solution? This might sound very complicated, but I think treating black people with dignity and respect, I think is my hot international relations take for the day, okay? That's going to be my hot take. Don't harvest black people's organs. Well, there you go. There is the case of Henrietta Lacks, where Johns Hopkins University took her cells and didn't really reimburse the fam. So while we're not harvesting their organs en masse, that would be actually an example of us using the bodies of black people for the benefit of large corporations. I mean, The fact that I even can actually take that and be like, well, wait a second, there actually is a case, is kind of messed up, isn't it? The fact that I can do that is kind of fucked up. Anyway, all I'm saying is that if we don't act like a hypocrite when it comes to our own human rights abuses, it'll be easier for us to try to criticize others for their human rights abuses and try to encourage them or push them to act better. I think that's not a difficult thing to accept. Whether or not it's a whataboutism doesn't matter if it's effective when they do it. Plus, I would also like to see black people treated better in this country. So, the criticism, even though it's a whataboutism, it has an effect. Does anybody really disagree with my take? I don't think it's a radical take. Anyway, all I wanted to point to here is China asking us to stop human rights abuses against black people, or is it just to defend their own genocide? The thing is, I don't think that China has any concern about the conditions of black people in this country, really. Even if they've taken met with, I think it was them or North Korea. I think it might have been North Korea who met with like the Black Panther Party ambassador that was exiled from the United States because he had charges against him. China is not one that deeply cares about the struggles of minority groups around the world, really, in my opinion. And I think maybe you could say maybe there was a past government that did, but China's had this policy for for a decent long period of time now, where if there is a human rights abuse going on with the country they are working with, they look the other way. I mean, not to say that we don't also do something similar when it comes to Saudi Arabia, even though thankfully we're somewhat correcting course, but we still back the Saudi blockade. A great example would be right now is Myanmar, or a lot of dictatorships they work with around the world. But a prime example would be Myanmar. China is the primary backer militarily of Myanmar. And when I say that, that means they sell them guns, sell them tanks, sell them all that stuff. And since the coup happened, and they did used to meet with military officials, they actually met with military officials 2 weeks before the coup after meeting with Suu Kyi. As the riots have started and protesters keep getting killed, dozens every day, tons of protesters just piling up and they get shot. A Chinese factory burnt down. And they never commented on the protesters getting killed. They never really cared. They didn't say anything to condemn the military for doing that or anything of the sort. But once a Chinese company burnt down, then they spoke up. Then they commented. Then they cared. So it's not, but again, China doesn't have a long history of caring about the rights and security of protesters. Protesters are just tricky business. Again, even though I think we have better standing on the issue, we have our own issues with protesters. But when it comes to Myanmar, that's not the only thing I would criticize them for. They also looked the other way when it came to the genocide of the Rohingya. And again, if they're the main supplier of Myanmar's military, it's not difficult to figure out that those supplies that they ended up giving Myanmar were probably used in the genocide against the Rohingya Muslims and the expulsion of 740,000 Rohingya Muslims from Myanmar/Burma. So anyway, Andrew, I would like to thank you with the Prime Gaming sub. I'm sorry we got into this diatribe. So anyway, I just wanted to comment on this because it was a really interesting meeting. I didn't expect it to go this way. I expected it to be a lot more polite. As a good jumping off point, I expected it to do the usual a hand back patting and handshaking of usual first meetings with diplomatic people around the world, but it just didn't seem to go this way in this meeting. Didn't seem to at all. And in fact, I believe Anthony Blinken commented on how this meeting went afterwards, and the replies to it are quite strange. And then after I look at this, I'll try to give my take. Okay? Wonderful. Let me see if I can give this to you guys quick. Here it is.
Jake and I spent several hours in conversation with our Chinese counterparts over the last couple of days. And we certainly know and knew going in that there are a number of areas where we are fundamentally at odds, including China's actions in Xinjiang with regard to Hong Kong, Tibet, increasingly Taiwan, as well as actions that it's taking in cyberspace. And it's no surprise that when we raised those issues, clearly and directly, we got a defensive response. But we were also able to have a very candid conversation over these many hours on an expansive agenda.
Now, I want to make something clear. When those statements were being made, of course, it was partially a message to the government, but it was also grandstanding. And when I say grandstanding, I mean the cameras were on them, and they were making, doing a lot of this for the cameras, for the international community, to make their position known internationally. And the reason I know this is because this is always how it works. And number two, when the Chinese diplomats tried to shoo the reporters away, instead Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, Jake Sullivan's also an advisor, waves back the reporters so they could do another response about Korea and Japan. So obviously a lot of this was grandstanding for the international community. Not saying grandstanding isn't needed, but not saying political theater isn't important, just saying that's what it was. Just wanted to be clear that that we didn't see the whole meeting. They also had a 2 to 3 hour closed door meeting afterwards, which he is actually talking about now.
On Iran, on North Korea, on Afghanistan, on climate, our interests intersect. On economics, on trade, on technology, we told our counterparts that we are reviewing these issues with close consultation with Congress, with our allies and partners, and we will move forward on them in a way that fully protects and advances the interests of our workers and our businesses. But just to take a step back for a moment, there are two things that we wanted to do in coming here and meeting with our Chinese counterparts. First, we wanted to share with them the significant concerns that we have about a number of the actions that China has taken and the behavior it's exhibiting, concerns shared by our allies and partners, and we did that. We also wanted to lay out very clearly our own policies, priorities, and worldview, and we did that too.
Okay, so that was a very just milquetoast normal everyday kind of after just kind of press briefing, just telling them what happened. And you know, honestly, I think that when I look at that, how that meeting went and how he talked about it afterwards, even though of course we didn't get to see the closed door section, that does not happen. It shows an extremely strong tone towards China. And, you know, usually how I usually like to do this is you start off soft and then you build up to the concerns, and that's where you start putting hard lines in the sand. They basically came in here not really guns blazing, but words firing. They went straight up hours before the meeting. They placed sanctions on certain Chinese officials and doing stuff in Hong Kong or just in the mainland or whatever. Then the meeting starts, and they go in the public eye, and then they shoot off about Xinjiang, they shoot off about Hong Kong, they shoot off about all these issues, they shoot off about trade, they shoot up about copyright infringement, and boom, 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 pow. And of course, China opens up, angry about those sanctions, saying that's not how you welcome a friend, that this was supposed to be like a shaky hand kind of event, and then goes into comments about, oh, you're talking about Xinjiang, you're talking about Hong Kong, what about black people? What about what you did in the Middle East, to Afghanistan, to Iraq, and the failures there? And then, of course, they try to shoo off the diplomats, and instead Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan wave them back in, and it then go on a diatribe about Korea and Japan. So a very interesting first meeting. I didn't expect it to go this way. I expected it to be the usual kind of backslapping for at least a week before they start going into a lot more of the stuff in closed door sessions. I especially didn't expect that to be in the open door session. I expected something more along the lines of, we know we have a lot of disagreements, and it's going to take a lot of hard work to get through them, but we hope through international cooperation and common values that we do share on some areas when it comes to peace and prosperity, that would be able to come to a common agreement. Nope, nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. Expected that, didn't get that. Very interesting. I didn't expect this. Whether this is going to work will be seen. Again, I usually appreciate a softer tone at the beginning than that. So I do disagree with it in a slight amount, but also it's a breath of honesty. So I guess emotionally, it's like, hell yeah, good point. And then when the Chinese ambassador brought up the black people thing, I was like, oh, hell yeah, good point. But rationally, I don't know if exactly this was the best way to go. I think the sanctions hours before should have been enough to get that message across. I don't know if trying to get the press back in was necessarily needed. Anyway, yeah, I don't have an extremely hot take about this interaction. I just find it extremely interesting, the international norms. That was the international norms and the discussion that was going on there. Any questions?